So this is part 2 of this video series that I'm doing as a prep for this Alderney Channel Islands conference. And this is, again, about, we're looking at English Channel trade defense during the First World War. So, in the last video, I introduced this, and we talked about how the Royal Navy and the Germans, the Central Powers, and the Entente, right? How the two conflicting sides of the First World War had set up their plans for trade, what the situation looked like before the war, and what they were going to do when the war started, how they were going to protect and attack trade. So by the crisis of the Naval War, as Admiral Sir John Jellicoe puts it in his book, he of course becomes First Sea Lord in December 1916 after having fought the Battle of Jutland at the end of May that year against Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Now, when Jellicoe becomes First Sea Lord, he's faced with this crisis, this naval crisis, and the nature of the crisis is that the German Empire is about to recommence unrestricted submarine warfare. Now they'd been pressured. Initially, they had started this, as we said, in the beginning of 1915, February 1915. They had been pressured essentially by the Americans to curtail their unrestricted submarine warfare campaign because it was so damaging to basically the German cause in the war, sinking neutral ships and killing civilians who had nothing to do with the war was seen as a barbaric act. And so the Germans curtailed this. Instead, they took their submarines and they put them back in the North Sea to go fight with the High Sea Fleet against the Grand Fleet in a series of naval actions that Admiral Scheer was going to organize to try to pick off parts of the Grand Fleet and hopefully reduce Britain's capacity to fight the war in a naval military sense. Now, as we know, the Battle of Jutland was not a success for Germany, and although they sunk several British battlecruisers, they also lost one battlecruiser and had several of them badly damaged, and they almost lost the whole kit and caboodle, the whole show, because they almost got caught when they were escaping, and had they lost all of the High Sea Fleet, then they would have been in big trouble as far as the rest of the conduct of the war goes. So Scheer tries this again in August, in the famous August sortie, and once again, things don't quite go the way he planned, and again almost gets caught. And so, although there's not nearly as much action as compared to the Battle of Jutland, it's still a very risky strategy that the German High Sea Fleet commander was undertaking. Now, he was hoping to use the submarines to fight with the High Sea Fleet, or to catch parts of the Grand Fleet as it's coming out of harbor. And they were also going to lay minefields across the North Sea, and they did, of course. And the idea was that, again, hopefully you'd be able to destroy small parts of the Grand Fleet, maybe create some attrition there. But this wasn't working. So now, as I've said before, Ludendorff has now become the chief logician, quartermaster general for the German army. Him and von Hindenburg are basically running the war now, and they think, well, they have a twofold strategy. First, they're going to pull back in the Western Front and set up a defensive line there. Then they're going to focus their military force against the East, against Russia, which they figure is the weakest partner, and they're hopefully going to knock Russia out of the war. And, of course, they actually do succeed with this strategy. Now, as part of this, they're going to double down on unrestricted submarine warfare, though, because, like I said before, they had Chief of the Staff von Holzendorf has promised them that they think they can knock the British out if they sink about 500,000 tons of British shipping for about 6 months. But this presentation is less about those grand strategic elements. Of course, those are important too. You have to understand what's happening in the strategic dimension to appreciate the responses that the Germans and the British are making. But this presentation is going to focus on what was actually happening in the English Channel, because this is a very interesting area in the submarine war, because there's essentially three significant districts, naval districts. Each has a different approach to trade defense. So I've talked very briefly about the Dover Patrol, the Dover Strait, where Vice Admiral Bacon was attempting to block the strait, and they were doing this with minefields and nets they were laying across between Calais and Dover. And the idea there was to physically create a barrier that would be impenetrable to surface and submarines, surface ships like destroyers and submarines and such. Now, Dover was the barrage, this is called Dover Barrage, which is discussed by Steve Dunn. Steve Dunn's done quite a lot of good work on this in this book, Securing the Narrow Sea, about the Dover Patrol. It's a kind of an updated version of Bacon's own famous two-part volume, The Dover Patrol, which is also worth reading. I think you can find it online for free at archive.org. So digitized there. Now, Bacon's problem is he doesn't think the submarines are really that big of a crisis. He doesn't think this is going to be that big of a deal, even though they're sinking. He's kind of out of the loop, though, because he's down at Dover. He can't see the big picture from the perspective of the naval staff and Jellicoe at the Admiralty, where this looks like a real crisis to them. So the Dover Patrol's not working as well as they'd like it to work. The submarines are still able to slip through, which means they can get into the other areas of the English Channel, and they can cause a lot of damage there, especially if they can get out into the Atlantic, where the Allies have not yet implemented a comprehensive convoy system, because they don't have enough assets. The great part of that story is told in another Steve Dunn book, Bailey's War, about Vice Admiral Lewis Bailey, who is, interestingly, he's commander of the Channel Fleet at one point, early in the war, but under his watch, HMS Formidable gets sunk. This is another book that Steve Dunn has done. And with the sinking of Formidable, Bailey sort of gets the, he's not very popular amongst the Admiralty anymore, so they shunt him off to this backwater, which is Ireland, the Queenstown Command in Ireland, and Southern Ireland. And the idea is that, again, he's sort of being punished for having lost this pre-dreadnought battleship. But it turns out, in a twist of fate, that in 1917, when the U-boats take the campaign to the Atlantic, that Queenstown, Ireland, and the so-called Western approaches become very significant, because a lot of the sinking is happening there. The German submarines, the U-boats are having a field day sinking these merchant ships as they're independently sailing up to the coast of the British Isles, and then to the waters of the British Isles, and they're just being sunk in enormous quantities, hundreds of ships. And the Germans sink the most tonnage that they sink during the whole war in April, when they sink about 800,000 tons of Allied and British shipping. Again, just indiscriminate shipping. And of course, the negative consequence of this is that the Americans declare war on them, resulting also from the famous Zimmerman telegram. I have Barbara Tuchman's book about that around here somewhere. So the strategy to try to... The Germans know that unrestricted submarine warfare is probably going to cause war with the United States, so they've come up with this cockeyed scheme to have the Japanese and the Mexicans attack America to distract the Americans so that they're unable to send their troops to France to influence the war. So obviously this is crazy. The British, through the use of famous Room 40, which I have, Patrick Beasley's great book, Room 40 here. This is the code-breaking room of the Admiralty's intelligence division of the naval staff. And they have a chart room, and they're tracking the submarines, and they're doing, like I said, they're doing code-breaking on naval communications. So they pick up, in diplomatic communications, they pick up this cable where the Germans say that they want Zimmerman is the German ambassador in Washington, and they're telling him he's supposed to go concoct this alliance with Japan and Mexico against the United States. Right, so anyway, the British find out about this, they send this to the Americans, and the Americans are not happy about this. Obviously, Woodrow Wilson, who had promised to keep the United States out of the war, now does a 180. He then pulls the Americans into the war, and of course, the sinking of all their merchant ships is profoundly influential in that regard as well. Many other countries also join the coalition against the Central Powers as a result of this, for example, Brazil, and I believe Portugal, amongst others. The other countries that are losing a lot of shipping are France and Norway. Both of those countries, obviously, their trade very important. Now, in terms of this submarine campaign that the Germans are waging, the best returns they're getting are in the Atlantic. This is where there's the least protection. Like I said, ironically, Queenstown was considered a backwater, so there's not a lot of resources, destroyers at Queenstown that they can use to escort and what have you. Bailey also has not the best plan initially about how they're going to deal with the submarines. He's sort of following standard Admiralty procedure, which had been to sweep these routes, these trade routes, in the notion that if you could clear them somehow, the submarines would be able to attack the merchant shipping. Of course, this doesn't work. You can't sweep the routes if you can't detect the submarines, and they have not yet invented a system for detecting the submarines. So they're developing, the Admiralty staff and the Americans as well are working very hard on developing anti-submarine devices and communications, which I have 2 books here on that subject. Well, really 3. I think I might as well, right? So, yeah, you can't less the Seek and Strike here by Hackman is sort of the definitive book on the development of sonar technology. Then one specifically about the First World War is Manston's The Listeners, which specifically looks at American development of sonar and hydrophone technology. And then Find and Destroy by Messemer, who is a great historian looking at the submarine campaign, talking about the development of anti-submarine weapon systems and so on. And so the British are taking the approach of, it's like a shotgun. They're just trying, they don't know what's going to solve the submarine crisis, so they're trying everything. And this means aircraft. It means they're flying patrol missions. They've got airships out there doing patrols. They're flying, like I said, they're sweeping these trade routes. They're building more depth charges so they can drop depth charges on the submarines. So they're trying everything they can. They're arming the merchant ships. They're training the crews of the merchant ships to be prepared, to how to work in a convoy, how to zigzag, and they're putting the dazzle painting on the merchant ships. You've seen the famous dazzle paint, right? So they're doing to try to camouflage the merchant ships. They're doing everything. They're trying to do everything they can, and it's sort of having an impact. The loss rates start coming down. Now this is where you get into this game, very much like a chess game, where each side reacts. So as the Admiralty starts taking these measures to reduce the shipping losses, the Germans move their tactics. So as they start putting more submarines into the Mediterranean, where there's less trade protection there, they move farther out into the Atlantic. They start attacking, although the inbound ships are escorted, the outbound ships haven't yet been escorted. So they start attacking outbound traffic. Now the thing is, inbound traffic you're going to get better returns on, because that's foodstuffs and things that the British civilian population and the military actually needs. So you can sink those, great. But if you can't sink those because they're now protected by escorts, you can still sink the outbound ships, even though they don't have anything in them. It's less effective, but you're still sinking them. It's important. You got to keep up these losses, the sinking rates. Now, in the English Channel, they're not doing that much sinking comparatively. Most of the sinking is taking place in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and some in the North Sea as well. The Scandinavian trade is very important there. A lot of ore coming from there. But they are getting some returns in the Channel, mainly at the Plymouth Command, because, as I pointed out in the other video, the Portsmouth trade, which is this French coal trade, is one of the first trade routes that gets convoyed, and it's very well protected. So the German submarines aren't able to sink much there. The Dover Strait, as I said, is protected by these minefields, and so the submarines can't really function there either, but they can function around Plymouth, the Plymouth district, and the Cornish coast, and they're sinking a large number of ships there. Now, initially, like I say, they're sinking anything they can. So they're sinking sailing vessels and fishermen and small transports, things like I said, private, just people's, coastal yachts and things like this. And so those aren't terribly useful. But every once in a while, they get a big cargo ship that's coming in or sailing independently, or sometimes they start. As the convoys have to deassemble or assemble, they're more vulnerable. So then they go attack them then, or they wait until night and then they attack them. Later on in the war, towards the end of the war, in the summer of 1918, because what happens is, as a result of this ongoing attrition, the Allies start to realize they're going to need to implement what are called coastal convoys, where not just the cross-Atlantic traffic, but all of the coastal traffic of the United Kingdom is going to have to be convoyed to protect it. So again, this is a massive regulatory process, which is quite a flip. And this is why it's so hard for them to do initially. It's quite a switch from what they were doing before the war, where they were just hoping to clear the seas of the enemy's raiders, merchant raiders, and then just let things go on as normal. So now it's not the case. You have to completely regulate everything. You have to have a vast convoy system set up, and you have to organize this diplomatically because you have to do it with the Americans and the French, and your allies have to now all be coordinated. So it's a huge international process. And this, of course, is part of the thing that leads to the post-war order when League of Nations is created, and these international organizations, International Shipping Federation is created, and so on. And these are all developed as a result of, they come out of this massive regulatory system that takes place during the war. A lot of this driven by the British Admiralty, interestingly enough. But so anyway, so as the crisis is developing during 1917, the sinking rates are quite significant on the western approaches, this western approaches area, where the submarines are operating and they're just having a field day there. Now, when the Atlantic convoys come in, the submarines have to react because now they can't just sit on these trade routes and sink anything they want. They have to attack the convoys, which means they have to be coordinated. They don't quite know how to do that yet. Their wireless app systems aren't that great, and they're not perfectly encoded. And of course, the Allies have broken some of their codes, so they're not great at coordinating yet. They get better at that in 1918. But what they do start doing, as I say, is they start moving farther out to sea, and also closer to the coast. So if you look at the loss rates, they sort of accelerate towards the end of 1917 in the Plymouth area of the Channel, but then after the spring of 1918, April, May 1918 specifically, which is when the coastal convoys are introduced, the loss rate crashes, and then the U-boats they're really desperate now because they have to go way out into the Atlantic and try to catch ships that aren't convoyed, and they do some coordination against large troop ships and things like that. But they're getting very desperate now, and the sinking rates are plummeting. The trend is very clear. The trend is quite clear. I mean, it peaks in the winter and spring, like 1917, 1918, is the highest concentration of losses for the Channel. And then after that, it declines precipitously. Also, the sinking rate against the U-boats starts to increase. And they never really get more effective. This is a big problem for them. They're in the summer of 1917, around June 1917, the German naval staff realizes that they need to sink a lot more merchant shipping, and they need to do it more consistently, and they suddenly realize they don't have enough submarines to do this, and the crews are too tired, fatigued to carry this on. So they've got a real problem here. They authorized building like 200 more submarines, but this is a fantasy at this point because you're trying to do this at the same time. You're preparing for this big, huge offensive you're going to fight in 1918, the Michael offensive in March, and at the same time you're defending against these attacks that are happening at the Ypres, Passchendaele offensive. The Allies are fighting there, and you're also fighting, of course, against the Russians. So this is and you've got to keep up you've got to supply the Austrians and the Turks, who are constantly struggling in their theaters. So submarines, building up a big submarine force at the last second takes a very low priority. And this is a real problem for the submarine campaign because they realize they can't realistically win it. And so this means that the gamble didn't work. And which is why I say it's such a bad strategy in the long run, because they set off on this gamble and didn't realistically prepare for it, and the end result is that the whole world came in against them. And as I say in the last video, the crossover point, as you would William Westmoreland would put it in the context of the Vietnam War, the crossover point is in September 1917. That's when the convoys are effective enough that the Germans aren't sinking enough ships. More convoyed ships are getting through than are being sunk. And of course, all this while, the Allies are expanding their anti-submarine capabilities around the Channel districts. So, in particular, their naval aviation gets much, much better. Hugh Williamson at the Air Department has developed this aircraft, which is called he's working with the Blackburn Corporation. They developed the Blackburn Kangaroo, which is a very effective anti-submarine aircraft. Even airships, like big rigid airships, have now been developed, and those are used to patrol the Channel. The destroyers there now have more, and the trawlers and all these other drifters and things like this have more depth charges on them, and they're armed with howitzers and so on. And so they're able to coordinate against the submarines and sink them. The minefield, what happens in particular at Dover, is Reginald Bacon inspired. and he's replaced right in November 1917. The same time Jellicoe is dropped, and First Lord of the Admiralty, Eric Geddes, brings in Wemyss, Admiral Rosalind Wemyss, to replace Jellicoe as Jellicoe's deputy. And Wemyss then brings Admiral Keyes, famous Rear Admiral Keyes, to replace Bacon at the Dover Command. And Keyes is a much more aggressive, kind of thrusting commander, and he was the head of a committee to set up better channel defenses earlier. So he's really committed to this. And what he wants to do ultimately is these amphibious operations against the submarine bases on the Belgian coast at Zeebrugge and Ostend, which they do conduct in April and May 1918. But what he also does is he reforms the channel barrage. So instead of it being, one of the things Jellicoe had done is reverse engineer the very effective German mines. These are the famous horned mines, kind of your stereotypical mine. And what those are much more effective at sinking submarines. They can be set deeper. They have more explosive in them. They're more reliable. So they build a lot. Jellicoe accelerates the construction of those right off the charts. So then those are now coming into play in October and the fall of 1917. And so they put a lot of those into the channel barrage. And that actually makes it finally quite effective. So now it's very risky for the submarines to go through the channel. They start losing a few more submarines, get hit by these mines as they're trying to get through the channel. Eventually, the German submarine commanders decide they can't authorize going through the channel anymore, which means they have to go all the way around the coast of Scotland. And in addition to that, it takes a long time, so it cuts down how long they can cruise out at sea, which makes it less effective. The Allies also start building the famous Northern Barrage, which is going to be a huge minefield, 100,000 mines across from the Orkneys to the coast of Norway, and to cut off that exit as well. Obviously, all this costs a lot of money and is not totally effective, but the point is that it's making life very hard for these submarine commanders. So the loss rates are crashing. Like I say, they've sunk a lot of non-British merchant shipping, but it's not very effective because, I mean, you're sinking, okay, you sunk some Greek merchant ships, or you've sunk merchant ships from Peru, right? I mean, this is not going to impact the outcome of the war favorably for you. So the Allies are getting much more effective. The anti-submarine capabilities are much stronger. Air defense is a lot better, so they're suppressing the submarines much more effectively. Submarines aren't able to sink as much. The convoy routes are now very, very, very good, and they're well protected. The loss rates are down to like less than 1% on most of these routes. So it looks like it's all over for the German submarine campaign. And finally, indeed, it is, because eventually what happens, of course, is the High Seas Fleet mutinies in October. We have Kiel, Wilhelmshaven mutinies in October 1918, and then the Allies capture the submarine bases on the Belgian coast, also in October 1918, as part of the famous 100 Days Offensive, when they win the war. And so it's all over now for the German naval force, and their gamble failed. And this is the most important lesson of this story, is that you undertake a gamble like this, where you're going to go up against the whole world. And this is incredibly, very, very risky. And so you better be prepared to do it, which they weren't. And they did this again in the Second World War. So you better be prepared, and you had better be realistic about the consequences, which are deadly serious in the sense that they finally lost the war in a definitive way. And it was in large reason they lose is because they undertook the strategy that was so incredibly dangerous without being fully prepared and cognizant about what was going to happen when they did. So it's a fascinating case study, and in the English Channel specifically, you just need to think about that as a microcosm for this bigger problem that they're dealing with. And it takes them a little while to kind of get a handle on this problem, but they do. The Allies do eventually solve it, and by the end of the war, they're in the process of designing ASDIC and the sonar and radar technology. And all of this is going to come into play in the Second World War, which, plus better airplanes and destroyers, all this is going to make it even harder for the submarines in the Second World War Battle of the Atlantic.